Alexis Conley, Bridgewater class of 99 and MBA 14. And I am the Assistant Director of Alumni Relations here at the university. On behalf of our office, I would like to welcome you to today's virtual Aluminar, Teaching James Joyce in an Era of Radical Change, a discussion with Dr. Ellen Scheible. Before we begin, there are a few important housekeeping items that I'd like to address in order to make this a great Zoom experience for everyone involved. First and foremost, I must mention that this presentation will be recorded for future use. In the top right corner of your screen, you will see two viewing options, full screen and speaker view. May we suggest the speaker view for optimal viewing? Throughout the presentation, please keep your own screen muted and with the video off at all times as not to distract from our presentation. Q&A will take place immediately following the talk. Please feel free to type in questions at any time during the presentation using the chat feature in the middle of your bottom toolbar. Questions will be collected and answered at the end. We thank you for your attention to these guidelines, and it is with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce you to our guest host, Dr. Robert Bradley. Rob Bradley is head of Bridge Research at State Street Associates, a team that bridges the gap between empirical finance research and practice. He is co-chair of the Bridgewater State University Employee Network at State Street and is on the board of State Street's Numerates Network. He is also a part-time faculty member at Boston College and Northeastern University. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Bridgewater State University, class of 2012, where he also majored in English, a master's degree in applied economics from Northeastern University, and just received his PhD in applied economics at Northeastern right in this past year, 2020. So I guess something good did come out of the pandemic. I'm sure Rob will agree. And Rob lives in Bridgewater with his wife and his 3 sons. So I'm going to pass it over to Rob, and I hope you all enjoy today's presentation.
Thank you, Alexis. And thank you. I can see everybody clapping for me on screen. So thank you so much. I keep joking with my wife that it will never get old, people recognizing that, although maybe someday it will. So again, I want to thank the Alumni Office for having me and letting me host. This is honestly one of the most fun things that I do. I look forward to it every single month. I'm especially excited for today's presentation. So as Alexis mentioned, I was a double major at BSU. One of my majors was English, and we today have a guest who will be discussing something that is kind of near and dear to my heart, and I think a lot of people's hearts. And without further ado, I will introduce you to our guest, and I'm very excited about this talk today. So Ellen Scheible is Associate Professor of English at Bridgewater State. Her research interests include Irish studies, British modernism, modern Gothic fiction, the domestic interior, and the post-colonial body. In her current work, Dr. Scheible explores representations of gender and sexuality within the discourse of homes and homelessness in Irish fiction, the role of homemaking in configurations of the nation in 20th century writing, and the influence of the Gothic tradition on modern subjectivity. Dr. Scheible was a Moore Institute Visiting Fellow at the National University of Ireland, Galway in 2016. Previously, she was awarded a Marion and Jasper Whiting Foundation Fellowship to support research in Dublin in 2014. And she's a BSU Commonwealth Honors Faculty Fellow and the coordinator of the Bridgewater State University Irish Studies Program. She's published on Oscar Wilde, James Joyce, and others. She's co-editor of Rethinking Joyce's Dubliners, published in 2017. And today we will be talking about James Joyce. And I had mentioned to Dr. Scheible, I have some experience with it. I think a lot of us have some experience with James Joyce. And then also I told her how intimidated I was by some of it. She assured me I don't need to be that intimidated. But regardless, I'm really excited because she's discussing some of my personal favorite works from Joyce. And I'm really, really excited and interested to hear your take in connecting it to today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you. So please, Dr. Scheible, take it away.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you, Alexis, both of you, for the invitation for today. And I'm so glad to see so many of you, even though you're just black boxes. I'm excited for the Q&A when you can unmute your video. Is that what you do to a video? Turn on your video, and then I can see your beautiful faces. So stick around. I promise the talk is not that long, so we should have some time for some Q&A. What I will read to you today is both a personal narrative and an academic paper. In the second half of the talk, I address two of James Joyce's short stories, Araby and the Dead, both from his 1914 collection, Dubliners. The early stories of the collection, including Araby, are narrated from the perspective of childhood reflections, while the middle stories are part of the second section of Dubliners, focused on adolescence, and the final stories offer a dark version of disillusioned Irish adulthood. In these early stories, and Joyce's final story, The Dead, we see the strongest references to racial otherness and whiteness as both personal and political issues challenging the formation of the Irish nation in the early part of the 20th century. For those of you who need a refresher on Dubliners, I'm sure you all read it in preparation for today's talk, maybe even read it twice or memorized it. I want to offer two quick plot summaries as a preface. Araby is about a young boy who lives with his aunt and uncle in a working class Dublin neighborhood. He fantasizes about his friend's sister and wants to buy her something from a traveling bazaar that advertises Oriental commodities. His uncle forgets that the boy has asked to attend the bazaar and comes home late with the money for the ticket, leaving the boy to barely make it through the entrance gates before closing time. In the end, the boy has no money to afford a gift for his love interests, and he leaves the bazaar feeling small and useless. The Dead tells the story of Gabriel Conroy and a New Year's party at his aunt's house that he attends with his wife, Greta, on January 6th, the Catholic feast of the Epiphany. This party happens the same time in the same way every year, suggesting a kind of melancholy repetition to both life and celebration in Dublin before national independence. Gabriel spends the majority of the party fantasizing about being alone with his wife that evening after they return to their hotel for a night away from their children. Gabriel has several encounters with women at the party where he finds himself misunderstood and embarrassed, including a final encounter with Greta at the hotel when he realizes that she spent much of the evening thinking not about him, but rather about a lost love from her past named Michael Fury. Michael died from pneumonia after walking through a major storm to the convent where Greta was living just to profess his love for her. Clearly, Michael is dead before the story opens, but his presence haunts the text up until the very end, when Greta's memory of him keeps her from a long-planned romantic evening with Gabriel. The other character in The Dead that is important to my talk today is Freddy Mallons. He is the son of a partygoer who is a renowned alcoholic. He himself is the alcoholic. During the famous dinner scene from The Dead, Freddy asks about a Black musician, only to face silence from the other guests. Freddy's character might be one of the most important to Joyce's critique of Irish identity and race in his work. So before I begin my formal presentation, I just wanted to say that this is a PG-13 talk. Nothing too dangerous, but Joyce was kind of a PG-13 guy. So just in preparation, be ready. Okay, so I think the title that I gave you was Teaching James Joyce in an Era of Radical Change. When I was 17, my boyfriend, who was a year older than me and had already started college, came home for winter break with a copy of Richard Ellman's biography of James Joyce. The National Merit Scholar that he was, he decided to pick up some light reading after finishing a seminar in British literature featuring Joyce's writing. I know this might be surprising for a literary modernist like myself, but there was a time in my life when my early feminism insisted that I shun canonical male authors, especially pretentious ones like Joyce and Hemingway. I balked at the time he spent engrossed in the biography and told him I would never let a writer like Joyce take up that much of my time. 5 years later, I started graduate school, took a modern British fiction seminar, and fell in love with the enemy. I begin with this story because at Bridgewater State, most of my students are first generation and working class, categories I didn't have words for as a teenager. Many of them are commuters and transfer students, and they remain consistently unsure of their college experience, wondering if college is actually for them and if they belong there. Often, their parents work for the state and they grow up fluent in union loyalty and civic pride, and they aren't always in their late teens when I meet them. Sometimes they're 25 or 30, not quite returning students, but old enough to be impatient with the classroom antics of younger, less responsible learners. I am especially equipped to teach BSU students because when I was 17, I couldn't have predicted that a year later, at 18, I would be transferring from a fancy New England liberal arts college back home to a local state college in Southern Maryland because the money fell out and my small business owner parents couldn't afford another year of high tuition. But I did know that my parents didn't finish college and that I couldn't pronounce the names of schools like Bowdoin because I'd never heard of them before, and that novels by James Joyce were out of my intellectual price range. Besides the obvious larger academic infrastructure in the late 1990s that fought the culture wars and embraced multiculturalism, pitting Joyce's work against writers who seemed more accessible and more representative of a greater population of readers, I imagine that this early sense I had that Joyce was exclusive and incomprehensible, therefore arrogant and pompous, came from an embedded sense of difference I felt from high school on. I grew up in a rural place where folks dropped out of high school at 14 to run family farms, or they studied mechanics at the tech center, planning to fix cars or work in the service industry after graduation instead of going to college. I read Joyce in my advanced placement classes, and I didn't connect in any way with the prose or the intro lectures, setting Joyce up as a beacon of English literature. At that time, I loved Dostoevsky and Sylvia Plath, identifying, or so I thought, with Raskolnikov and Lady Lazarus, never hearing once from a teacher, perhaps because I wasn't listening, that Joyce was Irish or Catholic or the son of an alcoholic or forced to leave school as a young person or fundamentally opposed to marriage or so defensive but proud of his culture that he wanted to heal it through art. I routinely teach within the Irish Studies program that I founded here at Bridgewater, and I teach Joyce every semester, from writing about literature intro classes to graduate seminars, regardless of my course assignments. My students connect to him like family because we focus on his devotion to both a place and an idea, concepts that deeply inform the deep-seated heritage of our New England first-generation classrooms. Understanding Joyce for my students means seeing him as a flawed but fiercely protective writer who actually fought publishers over words like bloody and phrases about women crossing their legs because he refused to abandon the stories he knew could bring change to his soon-to-be nation, and instead chose to confront leftover Victorian prejudices against sexuality and poverty. Boston and Dublin have similar histories when it comes to reckoning with modern progressive ideas and traditional provincial moral values. Hybridity and bifurcation are familiar states of being for my students because our New England is both racially segregated and radically liberal, hyper-educated, as Gabriel Conroy would say, but also regionally poor and often immobilized by addiction. Students like it when Joyce calls bullshit on political and economic hypocrisy, and they are particularly entertained by how deep his cultural understanding of Catholicism ran while he hated every bit of its tyranny over Ireland. While Joyce's critique of Catholic tyranny is rampant in Dubliners, it emerges alongside an argument about race, particularly in stories like Araby. Araby is perhaps Joyce's most anthologized story after The Dead, where Joyce's use of Orientalism, alongside his critique of Catholicism, defines the story's main progression. For my students, understanding the way that an other might be racialized to benefit a dangerous Catholic agenda connects their New England identity, often seen as Irish, white, and Catholic, to the reality of their experience, which is usually defined through poverty, rural living, and disenfranchisement. It is through a discussion of the home in Araby that Joyce's harsh confrontation of Irish racism emerges. While Joyce's ongoing interest in mirroring the domestic interiors, or the inside spaces of the home, represented in his texts, with current issues of national development and struggle, surfaces as one of the key tropes in his writing. In Araby, we see the exterior spaces of homes and communities represented within the national debate and personified as images of otherness. The domestic spaces of the story evoke a non-white presence when they gazed at one another with brown, quote, imperturbable faces, end quote. In Araby, the home, particularly the exterior, punctuates the story. The houses and urban dwelling spaces seem to have feelings, quote, the houses had grown somber, end quote, and can imitate physical attributes, quote, the lamps of the street lifted their feeble lanterns, end quote. The story opens with images of domestic exteriors and interiors, quote, the former tenant of our house, a priest, had died in the back drawing room, end quote, only to then turn to the central figure in the story besides the narrator, Mangan's sister, forming a parallel between the girl and the urban environment. The first two paragraphs of the story place Mangan's sister in the central position as metaphor for both home and other. She is the uncanny representation of the narrator's sexual development, an experience that is both intimate and foreign to him. And her brownness is the reflection of the domestic exteriors that frame his childhood. And this is a longer quote from the story. So, I kept her brown figure always in my eye. And when we came near the point at which our ways diverged, I quickened my pace and passed her. This happened morning after morning. I had never spoken to her except for a few casual words, and yet her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood. The irony in this story is, of course, that we never truly discover Mangan's sister's name. So the boy's stimulation by his experiences with her, the summons to his foolish blood, remain private and repressed within the narrative. Vincent Cheng describes her as, quote, a blank female page whose namelessness invites male inscription. Many Joyce critics have emphasized how Mangan's sister becomes a holy grail to our boy narrator, and in that metaphor serves as the iconic image of womanhood for the Catholic patriarchal perspective that dominates the narrator's understanding of his existence. This is clear especially when he visits the room in his house where the priest died, so that he can meditate on his desire for her. And this is another long quote from Joyce. One evening, I went into the back drawing room in which the priest had died. It was a dark, rainy evening, and there was no sound in the house. Through one of the broken window panes, I heard the rain impinge upon the earth, the fine, incessant needles of water playing in the sodden beds. Some distant lamp or lighted window gleamed below me. I was thankful that I could see so little. All my senses seemed to desire to veil themselves, and feeling that I was about to slip from them, I pressed the palms of my hands together until they trembled, murmuring, oh love, many times. In this space, the boy hears no sound and experiences very little vision. The priest's death chamber redirects our narrator again to the exterior of the home, where the anthropomorphized behavior of the rain, lamps, and windows remind him of what he cannot see inside the domestic interior, Mangan's sister and her feelings, as well as his own death, where he might slip away, just like his priest doppelganger who dies in the first story in the collections called The Sisters. In her brownness and otherness, Mangan's sister is again only identified outside of the domestic interior. She is the exterior, fragmented, and blinded expression of the home that our narrator will never have. While home becomes the holy chalice in this way, it is also a brown version of itself. an othered kind of home that both excludes the boy and reflects his own outsider position within his aunt and uncle's home. Joyce uses both female sexuality and racial otherness as escapist dreams for a young male narrator who is trapped within a foreign domestic interior. Not only is this an uncanny way for Joyce to expose an Ireland that blinds and deafens its inhabitants, a home that kills its own priests with its Catholicism, but it also fragments the brown female other in the story, similar to the braceleted arms in T.S. Eliot's famous poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, in order to make this distinction. So this is the last, I think, big quote from Joyce. The high, cold, empty, gloomy rooms liberated me, and I went from room to room singing. From the front window, I saw my companions playing below in the street. Their cries reached me, weakened and indistinct. And leaning my forehead against the cool glass, I looked over at the dark house where she lived. I may have stood there for an hour seeing nothing, but the brown-clad figure cast by my imagination, touched discreetly by the lamplight at the curved neck, at the hand upon the railings, and at the border below the dress. We might want the brown-clad figure of Mangan's sister to be a harbinger of power, but she instead emerges as a fragmented, unnamed other to our narrator, submissive to the external force of the lamplight and sexualized by the boy's psyche. In his description of the girl, Joyce shifts earlier references to her brown figure to this later manifestation of her brown-clad figure, offering her brownness as both her actual body and a dress that the boy narrator fantasizes about removing. Again, her brownness is external, part of the exterior description of her image, similar to the descriptions of the domestic exteriors that open the story. She reflects his adolescent sexual desire back to him, offering him a partially blinded glimpse of a version of the interior self mistakenly believed to be liberated by internal mobility, but actually limited by an external world that he cannot fully access. Mangan's sister's body, the brown-clad houses, and the vases at the bazaar that the boy clearly cannot afford are all symbols of the boy's position as an outsider, even though he is the main Irish Catholic figure in the story. Joyce suggests that Irish Catholicism will keep Ireland excluded from all versions of otherness to their own detriment. It will limit their access to diversity and to an understanding of a fully manifested identity as both a nation and a people. Not surprisingly, the dead is the tool I use to crack open my students' recognition of their own regional struggle. Similar to the boys' struggle in Araby, BSU students often wrestle with the modern and the traditional, the educated but provincial and immobile experience of becoming rooted in New England. I sell the dead as a fancied up version of the recognizable heteronormative experience that crude hipsters of my era would call a cock block. I tell them that what's at stake in this story is the consummation of an idealized future where progressive but blind politics must recognize itself in the parts of its demographic that it does not understand, and worse, does not realize that it does not understand. Finally, I urge them to see what Gabriel Conroy can't, that recognizing and maintaining gender, class, race, and political differences while seeking equality is essential to cultural awareness and was foundational, in Joyce's view, for Ireland's future success as a decolonized nation. Nationalism and the white supremacy that comes with it is the sound of snow falling on graves, erasing the past and us with its cold whiteness. While Gabriel will always be one of my first loves in the Joycean universe, I make this point best in class through the character of Freddy Mallons. Just as Shakespeare's fools ironically invoke elemental words of wisdom, Freddy's drunken questions about American Blackness at the dinner table in The Dead presents a diagnosis of an Ireland that cannot move forward into modernity without recognizing the multiplicity of cultural voices that overtly challenge nationalist calls for a unified declaration of Irish Catholic identity. While much contemporary criticism persuasively argues that James Joyce was a radical nationalist, I urge my students to read Joyce as a writer deeply engaged in critiquing the more traditional tenets of Irish nationalism, while simultaneously invoking otherness as a tool that sometimes, but not always, offers an authentic voice of Irish selfhood. This version of selfhood can be similarly categorized within what Marjorie Howes, in a text titled Semi-Colonial Joyce, calls, quote, alternative narratives of the nation, end quote, where characters like Gabriel Conroy and Stephen Dedalus from James Joyce's novel Ulysses, quote, reject the conventional forms of national belonging offered to them by cultural nationalism, end quote, only to end up postulating other alternative national discourses. Consequently, in Dubliners, Joyce interrogates whiteness as a signifier of shallowness and limitation when the characters in his stories consistently do not recognize, quote, that the color of the race problem is white, end quote, as Robert Jensen posits in his essay, Whiteness. Instead, the character's whiteness reflects inadequacy and disappointment as much as it leads them to overlook the violence encoded in their whiteness. This critique of whiteness is the center of Joyce's critical focus on proto-national Catholic identity. In a radical early move against racist tropes of modernization, Joyce warns against collapsing whiteness and Irishness in the pursuit of colonial subjectivity. David Lloyd endorses this critique in his important defense of the Irish as, quote, non-white in relation to Britain, end quote, where he points out that, quote, fictive as we have learned race to be, it would be a mistake not to recognize that that which it designates is a fulcrum for resistance, even as it is an alibi for domination, end quote. In Joyce's critique of Catholic nationalism in Dubliners, he points out the exploitive dependency on otherness, often orientalized in the imaginations of his characters, to fuel nationalist sentiments, and questions the presupposed alliance with whiteness that might be keeping Irish identity from modern progression. Recognizing the insidious relationship between whiteness and national identity functions as a Wildian mirror for my students. And when my pedagogy works, they see their own faces in the glass and rage against those reflections, just like Shakespeare's Caliban in the preface to Oscar Wilde's novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Perhaps no other story in Dubliners places whiteness at the center of its narrative with the same sense of urgency as the dead. The famous line, "Snow was general all over Ireland," rings true from the beginning of the story to the bitter end, when Gabriel must decide how to interpret the life-changing revelation he has about his wife that could decode his role in the future nation. While the story takes place inside the domestic interior of the Morcans' home for the most part, it is the exterior, snow-covered landscape of the missing nation that slowly penetrates the home, sneaking in through modern conventions like galoshes, tapping on window panes, reminding Gabriel how suffocated he feels, and ultimately teaching Gabriel about love when Greta tells of Michael Fury's death from exposure to the harsh conditions of the winter countryside. The sheer whiteness that the snow presents is impossible to ignore once we are faced with Freddy Mallons' question at dinner regarding the partygoers' silence surrounding a questionable American musician. Quote, "Is it because he's only a Black?" End quote. Freddy Mallons and Gabriel Conroy are doubled from the earliest moments of The Dead when they are both late for the party and the aunts wonder when Gabriel will arrive. They do not worry about Freddy because Freddy Mallons was always late. Freddy is Joyce's Shakespearean fool, a character who seems to only have a bit part in this tragedy of Gabriel's epiphany, but one who reminds us how the silence on race in the domestic interior of the story is paralleled in the exterior world by the tapping of whiteness from the snow outside. The aunts think that Gabriel will be able to handle Freddy's drunk behavior and worry about Gabriel's lateness because of his needed role as caretaker, but Joyce shows us that this is a ruse. In his interactions with Molly Ivors, Freddy Mallons, and even his own wife, Greta, Gabriel Conroy brings silence. He stifles conversation and misreads intentions enough to render other characters silent, and at times emotionally overwhelmed. Instead of making speeches, Freddy Mallons asks questions. And for Joyce, this is how Ireland should begin to break down its silence on the lack of difference, keeping it isolated as a colony and a future nation. For my students, this is how we confront the overwhelming whiteness in our classroom and break the silence that historically links whiteness with economic entitlement in our supposedly progressive landscape of southeastern Massachusetts. As the story's presiding cockblock, Michael Fury helps us to understand how whiteness and blindness are overlapping metaphors in the dead, and students are driven to interrogate the power of Michael's haunting role as the ghost of Ireland's past, an old boyfriend whose memory competes with Gabriel's romantic inclinations for Greta's attention. The whiteness surrounding Michael, even before the story begins, sounds the death knell of a devotion to anything with the force that Michael is devoted to Greta, or the way that Molly Ivors is devoted to nationalism. Michael Fury's misdirected devotion to Greta as a metaphor for the future nation is symbolized through his frozen body and snow-covered grave. The whiteness of death in the dead is the mark of erasure of both self and other, leaving no choice for Gabriel but movement away, possibly emigration westward in the end. Freddy's question about race during dinner falls on deaf ears, because Dubliners in the dead are defined by the whiteness covering their potential nation. They miss the brilliance of Freddy's question because they disregard him as a drunk, marginalized outsider, undeserving of a voice. Joyce warns against this exact perception, suggesting that it is in fact Gabriel who is blind to the progression of modernity in Ireland, not Freddy. Gabriel's blindness, like the snow, permeates every scene of the story, from the dance with Molly to the dinner table speech, to the moment he notices Greta on the stairs and cannot think of her name. Gabriel cannot see what Freddy clearly and adamantly articulates as the central problem in Irish thinking, demarcated by the stories in Dubliners. To speak about Blackness or queerness or otherness as anything more than an exoticized figure to be consumed by the Irish in their quest for national identity is to expose a possible camaraderie that betrays the power of difference and marginalization rather than the strength of national unification. In the Black and Green Atlantic, David Lloyd clarifies the paradoxical racism of the Irish in the United States after 19th century immigration by explaining that, quote, race, we may observe, is a variable set of structures, not a quality. And as the place of the Irish in that structure changed, or as they entered into a new racial matrix, so both the nature of their own racialization and their relation to other races inevitably altered, end quote. Lloyd draws attention to the identity struggle that the Irish underwent as a population that knew both colonization and racial subjugation on the other side of the Atlantic when they immigrated to the United States, and their whiteness offered them privilege through its definability as specifically not Black. This kind of privilege is similar to the presumption of whiteness that Joyce understood to be holding Ireland back from its development as an independent and modern cultural leader. The same privilege is often the defining force of whiteness in public university classrooms in Massachusetts, where an inheritance of Irish pride remains strong and can be both inspiring and debilitating for my working class white students. In a post-famine, pre-revolutionary Ireland, James Joyce saw clearly that Ireland's inability to recognize its own otherness would keep it from the cultural development needed to move beyond traditional nationalism to a model of alternative national thinking, a space where a nation is, quote, the same people living in the same place or also living in different places, end quote. And that's a quote from Joyce's novel, Ulysses. My main goal when I teach Joyce is to make sure my students understand that living in different places can be both a geographical and an emotional or ideological experience for both white students and students of color. And we must work to eliminate the silence blinding us to a long history of racial privilege that keeps those experiences separate and isolated in our local communities and classrooms. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. So before I monopolize things and ask all my questions, I'll just remind everybody that if you have any questions, you can share them in the chat. I mean, also, Ellen is very much open and would love if anybody wants to interact and kind of, I think, turn their video on to talk or ask questions. Feel free. So if you turn your video on, then I'll know you want to ask a question, or you can just so we can see you. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, either put them in the chat or you can just let me know, or unmute yourself or something. We can all have a conversation. So very quickly, I just, I appreciate kind of the personal narrative that you put to that. And then also how you tied it back to the way that you actually talk about this in class. For me, it actually really helped me, first of all, remember both Araby and the dead and kind of some of the key themes, but it opened up a lot too, to put it in the perspective of, here's how I talk to students about this. Here's the thing I want them to get out of it, which it was very helpful. So one thing I'm actually really curious about is just in general, the conversations that you have with students around whiteness. And I love this idea of, living in different places can both be geographical or ideological or emotional. And so this is something that I know, at least for me personally, I think, the events of the summer of 2020 with like the Black Lives Matter movement, the death of George Floyd, as well as a number of other, many other people, gave me a pause and a chance to think about, because it was both eye-opening and very familiar at the same time. And to me, it was one of those moments where I was like, why am I somehow surprised and also very not surprised? And it started actually, just personally, I had this perspective of, oh, I'm not seeing things from another person's perspective. This is a whole new way of looking at things. And it really was like overwhelming to me to be like, I've missed so much. I'm clearly not seeing things. And so I'm curious, just when you have students, if there's, because I mean, I know you have a range of ages and maturities and things like that in your classroom. So what is that experience like discussing this with them? How are the conversations? Is there resistance to this idea that, your whiteness can be blinding for you? How do those go? And is this somewhat, are people open to this idea, or is it a struggle to kind of pull them along to get to where you are?
No, I think students are very open, very open to this idea. I think that oftentimes educators, especially college professors, maybe not anymore because the last 2 years have radically transformed our lives. But I think that we tend to want to talk a lot in metaphor, and we don't often offer the space for students to have the real conversations that they need and want to have. And creating a space for that, finding a way to do that, especially in inter-level classes, can allow conversations to emerge that I think students are just really desperate in wanting to talk about. So I don't think that they feel necessarily hindered. I think they are looking to us to create a space for those conversations to happen. I think the way that it connects to Ireland for me is that, James Joyce's vision that I just presented to you, this sort of what I view as sort of this like radical idea that it's really important that a nation is diverse, was not what Ireland did. So unfortunately, they didn't listen to James Joyce. Not surprising, since he was definitely like an expat and, not someone that they maybe valued as much as we do now. But they didn't. And they went down the path of radical nationalism in a different way. I mean, they really unified underneath a white Catholic agenda when they became a nation in 1922 and launched into, a century or so of a lot of sexual and religious oppression. I mean, it doesn't mean that Joyce was right about everything. He wasn't. But he did see that identifying with this kind of unifying nationalism was going to hinder the development of the Irish nation. And I think that when I teach this to my students, what it does in some ways is expose, and I'm going to sound patriotic here, which I think is I see a few of my old students in the audience, so surprise. I think that what it does in some ways is remind us of what's great about living in this country, which is that on the best of days, we have a separation of church and state. And when that's missing, there can be a kind of agenda-driven nationalism in a different way than we're used to. And for much of the 20th century, this was a challenge for Ireland. It's also arguably the thing that decolonized it. So, you know, it's complicated, the conversation is, but that unifying sense of nationalism was also driven by a sense of, you know, a lack of otherness, a sense that to be Irish in the early part of the 20th century definitely meant to be white.
Perfect, thank you. Paula, did you have a question? Or just joining by video so we could see you? We appreciate both. I can't hear you, but I
can't hear you.
I think you're still on mute, Paula.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have like an external speaker plugged in or something that's keeping it from.
Yeah, it looks like you're kind of signed in twice. So it might be on your phone, maybe, where the audio is coming from. If not, if you can type it into the chat. So if you go down below, kind of hover down below, there's a button that says chat. So a lot of people saying thank you, by the way. Excellent presentation, a lot of enjoyment. So Paul, while you either type that out or unmute yourself, one thing I was gonna, so I was actually thinking something similar as you were talking about this kind of value of diversity at a national level. I think, you know, the United States, this is a narrative that we have, right? That we are a melting pot and all these things. And I think that is the thing that makes the United States the strongest. That is, you know, kind of the thing that has always been one of our best qualities in theory. And like you said, with separation of church and state, on our best days, this is something we strive for and really push for. And maybe not on our best days. There's, you know, you can see even in the United States where there is explicit separation of church and state, that doesn't always happen. Especially regionally, there's differences there. And then also with this idea of, you know, a melting pot or a diverse nation being valuable, I think this is basically ingrained in us as a nation. But at the same time, especially in recent years, you can see this push towards more of a nationalist posture. So even, you know, it gets very complicated, right, in terms of what that actually means. And so this, I think too, I've had similar experiences, you know, teaching myself where I've been trying to work in these conversations for students, because I think it also helps them, you know, I teach economics, but this helps them connect with the material. We have the similar conversations about, you know, economic diversity and things like that. And so you know, this idea that Joyce was both fiercely proud, but also very critical, I think is something that we should all kind of strive for, right? Is you should be aware of who you are as yourself. And if there's things you want to change about that or things that you don't like, then you should strive to. And you should also strive and be pushing for the nation that you're part of, the community you're part of, to be better. And I think that is something that oftentimes is seen as, I don't know, overly critical or negative, whereas really is to me is like the strongest thing that you can do, right? Is to be like, we can do better than this. So it's fascinating to me that 100 years ago, before Ireland was even a nation, that James Joyce was in this position to have that kind of perspective. It feels very modern, essentially. It feels like a little bit woke to kind of look at things from that perspective. I don't know that many people are describing James Joyce as woke all the time, but there's certainly a part of that there. So, all right, before I keep monopolizing, Alicia, well, actually, Paula, did you have a question? I don't know if.
Oh, you have to unmute.
Can I unmute you? I can ask you to unmute.
Oh, wait, try again.
We're going to try.
Is that okay?
Yes, sorry, we got it. Thank you.
Great.
All right, go ahead.
I have two thoughts running congruently through my mind right now. And first of all, there is some empathy and sympathy for the Irish people of that time, because their otherness was also what they experienced by not being Protestant and by not being British. There's a strong history that the Irish went of oppression. And so even though I see your point and I understand that there needs to be inclusion, I do have a certain feeling of understanding that at some point in time in a nation's development, there has to be a sense that they are worthy as they are. And they weren't really given that feeling by the British. They were not allowed to follow their own religion. They were not allowed to speak their own language. They were not allowed to educate their children. And so I have a lot of empathy for them as a colonial people. At the same time, I understand that they are very homogenized, or they were a very homogenized population. And as a result of that, there were and are examples, both historically and currently, of prejudice. They have a problem with the travelers, an acceptance of the travelers. I went to a course at NUI Galway a bunch of years ago, and it was wonderful. It was an intensive course in the summer. I'm a former educator, and it didn't just focus on education, it focused on all aspects of their life. And that was one of the things that they talked a lot about. And it really struck me that it was very comparable to our, in the United States, problems with prejudice. So I've got these two things going on at once in me. And that's it.
Yeah. So I mean, I would just say that what Joyce is not doing is he's not saying you Irish folks in the early part of the 20th century are racist. He's not doing that. What he's saying instead is you need to recognize what nationalism is telling you. And you need to pay attention. You, all of my family, I mean, part of the reason that Dubliners didn't get published until it did, because it was written much earlier, is that the publishing company in Dublin refused to publish it. And Joyce, even living abroad in Europe, demanded that it get published in Dublin, in Ireland, because he saw it as a looking glass. He needed Irish people to look into this mirror that he was holding up for them. But the publishing company didn't want to publish it because he used real people's names, like hundreds of them, and real streets and real names of places. And he was calling people out on things that he felt was holding them back from a sense of modernity and from actually building the nation that he thought Ireland should become. He wasn't saying that people were racist. He was saying that there was this lack of awareness and lack of sensitivity to what nationalism was actually propagating. And the reason that this is important is because these stories come out in 1912. 4 years later, there's a major revolution in Ireland, the Easter Rising in 1916. And then 5 years after that, Ireland is decolonized. They're one of the only, if not the only, colony of England that actually fights a war and decolonizes itself. History of, colonial occupation by the empire is one of the empire choosing to decolonize. So the empire leaves India, the empire, leaves Africa. But in Ireland, because of the wonderful historic moment of World War I, which you'll never hear me call World War I wonderful again, but in Irish history, World War I created this moment where the British were really torn, and Ireland had this potential for revolution that they took. And Joyce saw it coming. And what he said was, look, folks, you're going to be confronted with the option to become a certain kind of nation. And what kind of nation do you want to become? Because nationalism is really a kind of cloaked white supremacy. And it wasn't the other way around where he was saying, there's something prejudicial about you. It's that there's not an awareness of the reality of nationalism. And this ends up, unfortunately, happening. Irish nationalism after the development of the Free State is that it's linked, coterminous with Catholicism, and it becomes basically the defining force of Irishness through a new constitution, through a new sense of isolationism for most of the 20th century. And, you could argue, of course, if you wanted to, that this leads to the radical uprising of the IRA in the 1970s and 80s, and a number of other violent movements. You also would have to argue, because I don't see any way not to, that that's the only way that Ireland became a nation. So what do we do? What do we do when radical nationalism liberates us, right? I think for Joyce, what he was saying is, you pay attention to what it actually is.
Mhm.
Even if it's liberating you, right? Pay attention to what it actually is. And then on the other side of it, when you're a nation, make some better decisions. But that doesn't happen, not until roughly maybe 2008. Alicia, I see you maybe nodding and wanting to say something. And is it Alicia or Alicia? I don't want to mispronounce your
No,
name.
you're correct. It's Alicia, but forgive me, my voice is kind of wanting lately. Thank you for today's presentation. I am a BSU graduate, English writing concentration. I never read any Joyce, except for Araby in the early years of English. So I saw your webinar and I thought, I got time on my hands. I'm recently retired. And I picked up the Dubliners. And while I enjoyed it, I'm not gonna lie, I struggled at times. Can you speak to his use of language and his word choices where I found myself translating English to English?
Yeah, so Joyce is writing Dubliners just at the turn of the 20th century during a literary period that we call modernism. And I think a lot of people associate modernism with a later time in the 1920s and the 1930s between the world wars, when you've got people like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and T.S. Eliot and folks like that writing. But modernism actually begins in the late part of the 19th century. That's when we get this turn to a different kind of understanding of life that's more mechanized, led by mechanical reproduction, led by the oncoming slot of a kind of mechanized warfare that folks see coming. So Joyce is writing this in a time when art is doing two things. In the European continent, art is actually becoming experimental and different and new, as Ezra Pound wants to think about it. So eventually this erupts in artists like Picasso, right, who are doing abstract things, or novels like Ulysses that are trying to break down linearity. Dubliners is happening earlier than all of that, but at the beginning of it. And what Joyce is doing is he's combining two modes of modernist writing. One is experimental modernism, and the other is realism. And realism becomes a super important novelistic strategy in the late 19th and early 20th century to kind of reflect to people what was happening in their daily lives as a sort of condition of change. So what if folks were experiencing art as real time, real place, so that they could actually see some of the problems that might be arising in their lives? This is not a page turning, hot Pulp Fiction kind of style. Realism is oftentimes dark. For Joyce, in these stories, it can get very dark. There's a lot that's not said in these stories that once you read them enough, you see it. There's a lot of child abuse. There's a lot of alcoholism. There's a lot of violence, a lot of sexual trauma. So he's writing both as an experimental writer and as a realist writer. And so these are realist stories about what's happening, what he saw is happening in Dublin in the early 20th century that was holding Ireland back from becoming the kind of modern nation that he wants it to be. The word choice is based on this sense of modern experimentation with language, where he wants to take a word, like, let me think of one, because there are many. Like you might think of the word aporia, which is a weird word, or you could think of another word, even the word epiphany, which is a kind of not as complicated word, but he wants to take a word like that and then he wants to put it in a really boring sentence. So I went to the grocery store and I was faced with an aporia. And you might be like, what the hell, James Joyce? Like, why are you writing these, kind of boring everyday realist sentences and then like infusing them with this really radical vocabulary? What he's trying to do, of course, is stylistically juxtapose what needs to happen with what is happening, and to point out that there is a kind of monotony in life in Dublin right now that needs to be shaken up. And what it needs to be shaken up with is change, newness, modernity. And by the way, Paula had mentioned this turn to, the Irish, or this, removal of the Irish language from the national idiom in Ireland in the 19th century. This is all true, but Joyce did not endorse going back to it. People like W.B. Yeats and other Irish writers in the early part of the 20th century thought that everybody needed to go back to speaking Gaelic. Joyce thought that was bullshit. He was like, no way, there's no way we're going to be modern and we're going to participate. Oh, and Rob, this is for you, in like a modern economy, which Joyce thought was super important. Like Ireland needed to be a player in the global economic stage, even in the early 20th century. He said, there's no way we're going to do that if we don't keep speaking English. And what we need to do is we need to recognize the importance of that language. So it's twofold, Alicia. It's showing how there needs to be like really intense change and intellectual development in these monotonous everyday moments in Ireland. And then also we need to recognize that the English language is key. Like it's really actually important. That it doesn't mean that we can't learn, speak, and respect Gaelic and be bilingual, by the way, which everybody should be bilingual. It doesn't mean that we can't do those things, but if Ireland's going to move into a modern space, the English language is the way that's going to happen. That's what Joyce thought. Now, that's not necessarily what Irish nationalism did or thought, but that's what Joyce thought.
Really quick,
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, Alicia. Just to interrupt. So we're coming up on time now. We're going to keep talking for a few more minutes and answering questions. Dr. Scheible's been very generous to offer some extra time. For anybody who can't stick around, this will be recorded. So if you need to jump off, you can always listen to the recording. You'll hear what we have. And if you want to send a question to Dr. Scheible, you can send it through the alumni office. We'll make sure she gets it, and we'll get responses back to everybody. So thank you so much. This is incredibly fascinating from so many different angles. Lauren, I'm going to go to you next, but really quickly before that, Colleen said she's new to Joyce. If you had to pick a first read, what would it be? So we'll do this one quick and then go to you, Lauren.
Yeah, I would read The Dead. I would read the last story in Dubliners. Be prepared to not be overwhelmed. It's an underwhelming story, but it's as I think Alicia just asked really importantly, what do we do with the fact that there's all this underwhelming language with then these overwhelming linguistic moments? I guess you want to pay attention to what's not happening. Because often, in Joyce's writing, the things that are not happening are the things that he's trying to draw our attention to. So read The Dead. That would be my advice.
James Joyce's literary jazz. That's what I'm hearing. It's the notes you don't play, right?
Ooh, nice, Rob. Nice.
I'm trying. All right, Lauren, do you have a question?
Sorry. I didn't really have much of a question, but I just had like a statement. I just remember taking Professor Scheible's class last semester, and I really enjoyed learning the Irish literature, and I didn't realize that James Joyce like had such a large impact in like Boston and in Ireland. So that was really interesting to learn. And I have like Irish descent, so it's just nice to know a little bit of our history.
So real quickly, Lauren, I can't remember if we talked about this, but the sort of main founding person, the person that people see as kind of like the first real leader of the Irish Free State when they elect a president is Eamon de Valera. And he is part of the 1916 Easter Rising, the revolution that happens, but he is not killed, and everybody else is killed. They're all executed by the state publicly, day by day. He's not killed because he's American. And there, from the early part of national independence, there is this sense that Boston and Dublin are like forever connected, because there is this sense that emigration after the famine in the 19th century, the sort of overwhelming way that emigration was accepted in this country in a different way than we do now, after the famine in the 19th century, forever brought together that kind of Boston and Dublin relationship. And you see, I think, can't remember where it is in Boston, but someplace in Boston, and I know it's down like in the North End, close to the water, there is a famine memorial. And there's like a sort of dedication to folks that came over and also died on the way over on the ships in the late 19th century. But they came into the harbor, you know, they came into Boston and into New York as well. And there's a huge famine memorial in New York. So New England in general has this history forever connected to Ireland through immigration after the famine, and then through like the sort of first initial leadership in Ireland with Eamon de Valera.
Oh, that's beautiful. Have to check it out sometime.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lauren. That was one thing that kind of resonated early on. You were talking about like kind of these similarities between Ireland and New England, and that is, you know, one of those things that does feel very familiar. Just your description of some of the issues that were happening kind of early 20th century Ireland that feel, like I said, kind of fresh today in the United States. And then also this kind of that direct connection between Ireland and the U.S. You were mentioning that Ireland is one of the only, or was the only colonial nation to basically defeat the British and win their own independence. And my first thought was, well, that's kind of what the United States did. It's a different situation for sure, but maybe there's some connection there. Like we both beat the British, right?
Well, it's so challenging because, like I guess we beat the British, but we also, you know, committed genocide against an entire group of other people, right, that lived here.
Well, let's not bring in what do I want to call it? I'm trying to think of a gentle way to say it, but I was jokingly going to say, let's not mention 90% of our history, where it's lots and lots of things that are questionable at best. 90%, I don't want to pick percentages, but
the reason though that I bring it up, I hear what you're saying. The reason I bring it up though is because you know, the British were in Ireland from the 12th century on, so They had, you know, roughly 800 years, not even, 700 years of occupation, famine after famine,
right,
bad thing after bad thing. But this, you know, ability to separate from the empire in the early 20th century really comes from the decline of British imperialism that was happening starting in the late 19th century, combined with World War I, and then combined with the fact that Ireland received tons of support from other European Catholic nations like France. And, you know, much of my work and other people's work might argue that a lot of that had to do with a sense of whiteness. So part of the reason why we see that decolonization as even possible comes about because of a history of white supremacy.
It's a really good point. What I was going to make as a point is more the perspective from the U.S. side that, oh, this is something we share with the Irish. And there is, you know, as we all know, especially around these parts in Chicago and certain cities around the U.S., there's a very large, very proud kind of Irish American population. And I think some of that is I don't want to say exaggerated or something. I think there's a lack of understanding of the history there. Certainly from my perspective, I'm not claiming to know it or anything like that. It just feels like it's a little bit surface level, at least on this side of the Atlantic, in terms of that connection. Whereas, you know, not the actual immigration and things like that notwithstanding. There was another question that came up, but I missed it. But so somebody actually shared a link to the Boston Irish Famine Memorial. So that's from Michael. And then I think, Paul, do you have a question? I just saw you unmute yourself.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to say thank you to Ellen and yourself, Robert, for having this great presentation. And I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on with my video camera today. So I don't know. I'm trying to put it on. But I thought that was excellent today. And I love James Joyce. I'm from Ireland myself, from the north of Ireland. And I teach a course in Irish Studies, Ancient Celtic History at Bridgewater State. And I sort of allude what Ellen was saying, you know, working with the students, they're non-traditional students of the past 4 years, their desire to learn about Ireland, and some of them not having any interest in all, has been really inspiring. They dig deep, they push themselves. So I find that wonderful. And to sort of talk about Joyce, I mean, obviously he was a modernist, like all great Irish writers of the time. they had to leave Ireland because it was a confessional state. It was a Catholic state. I think it's rather ironic now. It's a big tourist industry selling, James Joyce coming, James Joyce walk tours and everything. But I think he was right in what Ellen was saying, that his premonition of Ireland was right on the mark, because the Civil War, after the War of Independence, the Civil War, in Ireland between 1919 and 21, sent Ireland down a different road. The North was forgotten about, unfinished business. And what we had with, James Connolly predicted, we had two states that it was the worst byproduct of colonialism. I think in the North, you had a Protestant sectarian one-party state. In the South, you had a Catholic state. And Joyce was right on the mark about so many things, that I think he embraced his Irishness, his nationalism, but he knew the dangers. And that's why I love Dubliners for bringing up all those themes and issues, and that he writes about in such a wonderful, powerful way. And Ireland has definitely become a more modern society. The Catholic Church doesn't play the role it does anymore, but we still have elements of that sort of, inward-looking, hating the foreigner right here and now. The scapegoat in Ireland is the foreigner from the east of Europe, people from former Eastern Europe, and you'll see that. They are marginalized, they're discriminated against, but I think, we've got a tremendous amount of work to go north and south, but without being glib, I see it's the bottle is half full rather than half empty. And I think Joyce contributed to that modern thought, and that's why we owe him he has this great legacy, and we owe him that,
That's so
Thank
funny,
you.
Paul.
Yeah.
Because I was going to turn to you and be like,
Yeah.
Paul, help me explain what's going on with this sort of weird paradox of nationalism, because it's really hard to explain why Ireland is decolonized the way that they are, because there are so, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong here, but there are so many contributing factors besides World War I, besides the sort of timing, that have to do with the kind of European support in some ways that they get. And also like the unification that comes from the sense of Catholic nationalism that now we look back and we critique, I think, pretty heavily, right? And Joyce was clearly critiquing before, but the argument is still in play about whether or not revolution would have even been successful without it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And, and you think of De Valera sort of led the way in Ireland for 50 years, and he had that infamous speech in 43, the comely maiden in the field, and he had this bucolic, romanticized idea of Ireland, which was never going to work. We had to join the modern world, and Joyce was right. And it did happen in the 1950s when De Valera was gone and Sean Lemass brought in multinationals. But Ireland really, I think, only began to really improve both north and south post 80s, because in the Republic of Ireland, it was a terrible state. Most people left, young people left. It was encouraged by the governments to leave it. And now, it's become a much more dynamic country, both north and south. And of course, the whole idea of Brexit, is now perhaps going to give some sort of unified Ireland. It was actually the Brits, ironically, is going to give us a united Ireland, perhaps.
I don't know if everyone understands what Paul's saying about Brexit. I hope that you might. I don't know, Rob, do we have time for me to explain that quickly, or?
We have time. I mean, you and I can stay here and keep recording and talking about stuff until you're done.
And
then
Paul,
anybody else who wants to listen can.
Okay, cool. Paul, you can help clarify for me too, because your focus is much more on politics and mine is in literature. But the way that I understand it, and this is a very sort of crude reduction, but Northern Ireland is still part of the Republic of Ireland is still part of the EU, and Northern Ireland now has Brexited the EU. So they are with the UK in having left the European Union. And if there is a referendum in Northern Ireland to ask if they wanted to rejoin the European Union, then they would somehow unify with the Republic over their sort of participation in the EU. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Which is, normally we would say, and Paul, again, tell me if I'm wrong. Normally we would say, oh, that would never happen. That's just, you're just pipe dreaming. But the problem is that what was fought for in the Good Friday Agreement in '98 for this sort of like soft border between Northern Ireland and the Republic that has been in place now for over 20 years has now returned to a hard border. right, Paul?
You hasn't got there yet, because I think that COVID has slowed everything down, you know, because we're in a kind of a lockdown situation. So it hasn't been resolved yet. And there's talk about now putting a border in the Irish Sea between England and Ireland, which the Ulster Protestant Unionists are aghast about because they don't want to see any sort of separation. So it's bringing the whole question of national unity and partition right back to the fore, right back in our faces, and it's going to be resolved sooner or later.
But it's fascinating to think that the end result could be a referendum vote that breaks up the UK and brings both the Republic and Northern Ireland into the EU, so that we can have basically the softest, perhaps, dissolution of a border that we've had since forever.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't know that. And of course, Brexit, the big deciding factor for the longest time in these final talks was that border between.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep. Interesting. I'm so excited to see all of you still here. Those you stalwarts who are still here at 1:45. Who else has a question? I'm happy to talk about this.
Anybody else have a question, or I'll go to mine because I have you hostage, so I can ask stuff. And now Paul's here too. Paul, you've been roped in. Does anybody have anything they want to ask?
Yeah, I know that theme. After this, there's another Zoom presentation from BC today, and it's called Communism, Sex, and All That Jazz: Struggle Against Minority in Interwar Ireland from 1930s onwards. So it's really going to take this theme onwards and develop that as well, because obviously 1930s Ireland, if Branfield had set the great play back in Ireland. What's a great play? What's it called again, Ellen? Where the family are introduced to the radio from America, and this is challenging Catholic orthodoxy.
Philadelphia.
Dancing at Lunasa. Dancing at Lunasa.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in this theme anyway.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Paul, can you put a link to that in the chat by any chance?
I can. Yes, I can. Let me find that now. Yep, sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
I was going to ask for the same thing.
We'll do that. Yeah. Let me find
Brian,
that.
in case, while Rob is pulling his next question together,
Sure.
Brian Friel is a famous playwright, Irish playwright that in the 1980s formed a group with Stephen Ray. Stephen Ray is a famous Irish actor. He's been in movies like The Crying Game, called the Field Day Theatre Company. And they produced a number of plays that basically helped to kind of create what we think of now as Irish studies. And so a focus on Ireland from a sort of political and literary perspective that emerged through the 90s and into the 2000s as the sort of disciplinary genre that I participate in now.
Yeah, I'm looking for the link.
All right, so my next question, super interesting, by the way. Sorry, I didn't mean to ignore your last point. Very interesting. I was just reading at the same time. So one thing that you said, there's two things that you said that caught my attention. One of them was that you had said something along the lines that novels by James Joyce were out of your intellectual price range, which I just love that kind of that image. And the other thing that you talked about was kind of Joyce confronting things through the written word. So his fight for using very particular words in his writing, his fight for actually making sure that Dubliners was published and distributed in Dublin so that people could see it. Could you talk a little bit about it just seems to me that between that and then his kind of premonition about what was going to happen when Ireland was decolonized and things, he seems, not to be too cliche, but ahead of his time, but in a way that's seems very deliberate. He's actively and proactively going out and pushing and pushing and pushing. Can you talk about that? Because he feels like both a very realistic person and also an artist, and also somebody who is, both the kind of in-group, but at the same time trying to push the in-group to say, think about what you're doing and beware. It just seems like this kind of paradox of a person. So could you just enlighten me a little bit maybe about Joyce himself and where maybe all those things kind of come from, how that comes together into one person?
I can, yeah. Let me start with a general fact and then go to a specific historical moment. So generally, when we think of famous writers from Ireland, and I'm not talking about Northern Ireland, sorry, Paul, but
That's okay, yeah.
from the Republic, people tend to name people like W.B. Yeats, and maybe Samuel Beckett, maybe Oscar Wilde. Like those people are really, canonized as Irish writers. They're also all raised Protestant and in a sort of ascendancy legacy that Joyce wasn't raised. He was raised Catholic. When he was born, his family had a good amount of money. They sent him to private school, but his dad was an alcoholic and lost a bunch of their money. And Joyce actually had to leave the private school because they couldn't afford it. He grew up in the late 19th century during a time when Ireland was desperately trying to attain home rule from England. So this would mean not that they were trying to become a nation yet, but they were trying to do the closest thing that a colony can do when they are not a nation, which is create their own self-government. And so they were trying to do this in the late 19th century, and it was led in Parliament by a man named Charles Stewart Parnell. And what ended up happening is that Parnell got to the center of the home rule debate, and folks really believed that he was going to get that home rule bill passed. But then, it was exposed that he was having an affair with a woman named Kitty O'Shea, who was married to another MP. And, she was going to get a divorce and he was going to get a divorce, and they were going to marry each other, which is against Catholic faith. And of course, the infidelity is against Catholic faith. And he had been heavily supported by the Catholic population in Ireland towards home rule. And after his affair was exposed, the support completely died. Actually, Parnell ended up getting very sick and dying, what, Paul, 3 years? I want to say
Yes.
3 years after the exposure of the affair. Joyce grew up with a political Catholic family that would spend night after night debating this very thing at the dinner table. And they would be talking. He had an aunt who was like a sort of staunch hater of Parnell, and he had a father who felt like Parnell was the unsung hero of Ireland. And they would just fight about how Ireland had missed its opportunity to truly gain modern independence, not necessarily as a nation, but as the closest thing to it, because of Catholic nationalism. Because Catholic nationalism had stopped supporting Parnell because of his infidelity and his willingness to get a divorce. And Joyce would grow up with this debate constantly happening. Home rule bill comes about again in the early part of the 20th century, fails again. And, many people might argue the reason we get Easter 1916 is because those home rule bills failed, right? Again, all of this leads to revolution. But for Joyce, there was this real sense that Catholicism got in the way of what could have made Ireland modern. So it's not even so much a nation as a modern entity. And it's not that Joyce didn't want Ireland to be independent. He did. He didn't want Ireland to be colonized by the British. He wasn't like a huge, support. He didn't go hang out in England. He was living in Paris and Trieste and Zurich. He was in the European continent, and that's where he saw modernity. But he thought that Ireland's pathway to being a modern nation was not through Catholic support. And he felt like what Catholic nationalism did was basically cause the fall of Parnell. And Parnell was kind of like the John F. Kennedy of the United States, basically. Like people really saw him as losing power way too early, dying too young from a lack of support. So that would be a sort of foundational element of what Joyce grows up with, along with his own experience with his family's struggle with alcoholism and eventually poverty, and his own, education at a public institution like UCD as opposed to Trinity College. He grew up with all of this, and it definitely informed, I think, the way that he saw his art and his role as an artist.
Such a great, I was thinking I was asking the broadest question and basically asking for a biography of James Joyce. That really, really paints a nice picture. Again, I mean, it's hard not to like find parallels with modern day and really fierce debates about, you know, exactly where a country should be going and what should be driving that, what kind of moral obligations we do or do not have. Or our politicians do or do not have, things like that. And it also makes me think, I mean, recently you start seeing in particular with like, there's this whole idea of like cancel culture and things going around, but a lot of people are talking about how particularly like famous women, whether that's like actors, actresses, singers, or politicians, you know, in very, 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 very recent times, we're talking like within a year of now, have, you know, their careers and things ended for things that, you know, would not have affected somebody who is a man, and usually are things that are just being projected onto them, right? I'm literally talking about the Britney Spears documentary that came out, and then there's a bunch of fallout from that with people going back and saying, you know, you can see how poorly she was treated, and you can see how poorly other female celebrities and things have been treated. I know these are not the same things, but the parallel to me is in that, you know, this almost like overly, well, this is patriarchal, whereas in Ireland it's you know, it's religious, but here there's this patriarchal push where this is what's holding us back, or one of the things that's holding us back is that there is this over policing of people, or this over setting expectations of what people should or should not be doing, and having that drive whether or not they're able to be successful in what they do, or things like that. You know, it's hard not to draw parallels. And the reason I want to draw them too is because I want to then ask my next question, my last one, unless somebody else has something, is like, what can we learn? And, you know, what do you draw as term? Because that's what came to my mind. But obviously there's lots of things that we could talk about in terms of this, especially that perspective that Joyce seems to have grown up in and drove him. So I think this will be my last one, but you know, what parallels do you draw?
Sorry, guys, it has to be the last one because there's another meeting on this Zoom.
We have 5 minutes, right? We got 5 whole minutes.
So
This
we
is
have
for
like
something.
2 minutes, and then I have 2 minutes to finish this out. So.
All right, two minutes. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think what we can learn is that we need to question what we want our future definition of a nation to be. We are not going to be in a space. History is not in a space where colonies are going to become independent from empires any longer. Most of the world has been colonized. Almost all of it is some form of nation. What Joyce wanted to ask us in the beginning part of the 20th century was, what does it mean for Ireland to become a nation? And how can Ireland choose to be a different kind of nation? What we have to ask ourselves now, and what I think Joyce is trying to teach us, is how do we redefine what it means to be a nation? Paul brought up immigration and what's happening in Ireland right now with a lot of just overt racism against people from Eastern Europe and other, you know, migration and refugee issues that we have across the globe. I think we need to rethink how we define nation. And that's something that we learn most definitely from Joyce. I just wanted to remind also, when we talk about things like Parnell getting divorced and stuff, you know, divorce was not legal in Ireland until the 1990s. And the reason was not because of British occupation, it was because of the development of Irish nationalism. So it was during the 1920s in Ireland that divorce becomes illegal. So just so that we remember that when Joyce was growing up, he was growing up in a slightly weirdly more modern place than what Ireland becomes in the 1930s and 1940s, as Paul was pointing out.
Sounds like a fair warning to me. And so I'm just going to really quick, Alexis, just say thank you so much, Dr. Scheible. This was a great conversation. I had a ton of fun, and hopefully we'll be chatting again sometime soon. And thank you for everybody being here, and thank you to the alumni office.
And here I come to say my final piece. I also would like to thank Rob so much for your help with the question and answer. It's always so effortless. And Ellen, this has been just a treat, a great discussion, very thought-provoking. And also, you know, I was an English major as well, so this was certainly a treat today for all of us. If anyone has any additional questions or would like to provide any feedback regarding this presentation, we encourage you to email us at alumni@bridgew.edu, and we will pass it on to Ellen so that she can respond. I'd also like to, I think Paul jumped off, but thank you to Paul for his great commentary today. Folks, please consider attending our next Aluminar, which is coming in 2 weeks on April 14th. It's called About Hiking and Camping. It's a discussion with Kate Naples, class of 1990, who has hiked and camped all throughout the White Mountains and also all over the United States and the world. She's definitely someone who's into hiking and camping, and we'll have some great tips for everybody as we all try to get outside now towards the end of this pandemic. Registration will be opening on the alumni webpage either tomorrow or Friday. And additional notifications and links regarding April's Aluminar will be sent via email and will be posted on social media. So please look out for those. On behalf of the entire Alumni Relations Office, we thank you for taking the time to join us today. We hope each of you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, enjoy the spring weather that is finally coming around for us, and have continued health and happiness. We look forward to seeing you at future virtual and in-person events. Thank you for spending your day with us today. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.